Oh, well, hello there. Welcome back to Introduction to Cultural Anthropology. Um, Today, we're going to be talking about politics and power and how we as a species, especially modern human, have organized themselves since we started organizing ourselves to where we are today, and how we have developed over time to include a lot more diversity and complexity in our uh, in the way that we manage ourselves as individuals, as cultures, communities. Um, we have to organize, right? And to do that, we created politics. And so we'll sort of dive into some of the earliest forms of um, organization, how we organized ourselves as a species in the form of bands and uh, tribes and chiefdoms and nationalities. Um, and we'll be talking about how that power that is usually associated with how those organizations are organized, um, how it looks different in different communities and what happens in those communities. So let's talk about it. Okay, so um, the origin of uh, sort of our understanding of how we have organized ourselves is in the form of this political organization called a band. Okay, we believe that most communities, if not all communities, as they have developed over the last 150,000 years, was in the form of a band. Now, a band is a group of people, usually in the range of about uh, 20 to 200. Okay, so that's about the average size of what we would consider to be like a standard band of people. So, relatively small. Bands are usually kinship based, so connected to each other by different families, so connected families, extended families. Um, they usually engage in hunter gatherer activities. So that's where you're going out and collecting all your resources on a daily or weekly basis by hunting, by foraging. Although there are a number of bands out there, modern day and historically, that also engaged in horticulture and pastoralism. Horticulture being small gardens or farms compared to agriculture, which is large farms and farming activities. Horticulture being something that can be done relatively quickly to grow some quick crops, especially if you're summering in a location, um, but then can be left to go fallow and might not be used again in the future, possibly. And then you have pastoralism, pastoralism being the herding of animals, usually small groups of animals, small herds, animals that can be herded. So we're talking about things like sheep and goats and pigs and horses and camels and llamas and alpacas and anything else that can be sort of herded and managed in a way that can be done nomadically from location to location. Um, this allowed um, nomadic bands to be highly mobile. Okay. And that was sort of the goal, was to be mobile, go to locations that had plenty of resources. When those resources ran out, you'd move on to the next location. Maybe there were spots that were better for springtime, summer, fall, or winter habitations. Now, that can also depend on what geographical location you live in. If you live along the equator, then your resources are going to be pretty standard year round. Right? So if you are a nomadic people, there might be different places where these resources grow, you consume them, you go on to the next location, and you usually create a cycle. from going to location to location to location. And the same way with folks that live in either northern or southern hemispheres. Um, Wintering in one location might be better because of um, easier climate to deal with. So they might make a long trek to where that winter isn't going to be as difficult, and there might be more resources, or it might be easier to hunker down and stay warm. Versus where in the spring and summer you might move to a new location where there's plentiful resources. Okay. Um, and again, bands are sort of recognized as the earliest form of political organization. So let's talk a little bit about bands. So, as I said, bands are usually organized between, say, 20 to about 200, maybe more. You don't see them getting too much bigger than that because that also puts more of a stress on the resources that are usually available for that group of people. Now, that might change depending if you were living in a very fruitful area. And that's usually one of the main contributing factors to a band is how many resources are available. If you live in an area, say like the Pacific Northwest or in the Fertile Crescent, these are very resource rich areas, which means that you don't have to move very far to gain those resources because they're plentiful. And you can sustain more people, so you can grow larger populations because of those resources. Now, if you are living in an area that doesn't have as much um, resources to hunt and gather, that will limit how many people that you can have comfortably within that community. And that's where you might start finding where bands might grow to a large size. They might, people are going to be feeling more of um, the harsh realities of not having enough resources. And that's where you might see different bands breaking off from each other. So that they can go to other places where there are more resources to fend for themselves. Um, so bands usually have a tendency to remain small, and that's due to typically resource management, right? Um, Bands are politically decentralized, which means that they are autonomous, right? So their decision making is based solely within that group, and they do not sort of recognize any other government around them um, because they are their own family unit, their own cultural unit, and so they will travel and do the things that they want to do. So they're not centralized in sort of that political organization that we might see today. Um, Leaders are oftentimes considered to be situational, which means that instead of having one full time leader that makes all the big decisions, you might have situational leadership in which, say, you're the best hunter, right? If you're the best hunter, then you're going to be helping everyone else that's going out hunting um, learn how to become better hunters. But you're the one that's going to make those ultimate decisions, like where are we going, what kind of tools to use, um, those kinds of decisions. And that goes the same for other activities, whether or not you're the best one at creating textiles, right? If you're the best at sewing or the best at crafting or if you're the best at fishing, whatever your particular skill is at, if you're the best at it, there's a good chance that you're going to be um, the leader of that activity. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you will be leader of the group in general. Um, Oftentimes the band's decision making is by consensus, and there can be elders that are involved that have more wisdom and experience, and they will certainly have um, say in what happens. But typically, we see a fairly democratic process in which um, everybody has an opportunity to say something about what's going to happen next. There's very little hierarchy within bands, which means that we don't see a lot of levels of power. There might be a few people that have that more influence, more prestige, um, but they are generally pretty egalitarian. Um, and that's very beneficial to the group. Um, Everybody contributes, everybody benefits. Okay, that's a big aspect of band life. Now, this can change over time. So, when you're young and capable, you're going to probably contribute more than you're going to benefit. And when you get old, you can't contribute as much, but you've already contributed a lot. So, you're still going to benefit from the group. So, it doesn't necessarily look the same like I have always contributed, I will always benefit. Sometimes you contribute more, sometimes you contribute less, sometimes you contribute in different ways, but everyone still benefits and everyone benefits from what everyone else is doing. Okay. Um, People in bands generally don't seek to have a lot of possessions. Okay, and this is sort of a very materialistic way of looking at things, especially when we consider American culture. We're very materialistic. Like, I need to go out and buy something new. I need to be able to, get some new toy or new whatever. So that's an issue. Um, so we don't usually see a lot of that uh, in these small band communities. So there's not a lot of possessions. And the other thing is that you usually have to carry your possessions with you. And if you have to carry everything you own, you're probably going to keep that load pretty light, right? So not a lot of personal possessions. Um, Commodities within that community are created by individuals, and nearly everyone has the same sort of maker skills, right? There's no general store that you can just go to pick up supplies. Typically, the only time that you would do something like that is if you were if you were meeting up with other bands, other communities, and you would trade between them. Maybe they've got a particular style of knife, or maybe they've got more furs, or maybe they've got some extra resource, more food of some type. That's when you can start trading. But otherwise, you're going to make everything that you're going to use. And because of that, everyone is going to be making stuff. So everyone's going to have that same sort of knowledge. And that goes for other activities as well. Um, the the whole idea of the hunter-gatherer society, in which men are the hunters and women are the gatherers, has pretty much been disproven. What we have come to understand is that usually somewhere in the range of about 80% of women went out and went hunting and did those same sort of activities as the men. And the men would oftentimes go out and be gathering just as much as the women would. And it's important to understand that, because even if we think about resources in general, there are very few places in which hunting is the main mode of food gathering. Okay, and those places are like around the Arctic Circle, where there isn't a lot of plant life. So the only way to survive is through the process of hunting and fishing. The rest of the world, however, does a lot of gathering. And in fact, it's a lot easier to gather foods than it is to hunt foods. So, more often than not, people would be gathering their food. Men, women, children would all be going out doing those same activities, and then would go on hunting expeditions or hunting by opportunity, right? Something comes close to you and you're like, oh, there's a deer, and dinner for the next, couple of days. So, right? When we think about hunter-gatherer societies, um, and their access to resources, this is, you know, we have this idea of them being very gendered, and that's not so much the case anymore, at least as to our current knowledge. Um, there are some gendered and generational activities, but in general, everyone has that same knowledge. Some of that can also be related to like medicine. In the case of like if there's a medicine man or some sort of a spiritual leader in that community, those have a tendency to be specialized positions. They might be gendered, they might be generational, they might be taught from one generation to the next generation, and be highly specialized. And so those kinds of things are usually one of the few specialized activities within one of these nomadic band level societies. So being a medicine man um, uh, definitely is one of those specialized traits. Now, when it comes to medicine in general, everyone's going to have a pretty good knowledge about medicine. So you when you're living in an environment where you're highly nomadic, the important thing for you to understand is your environment. So, your school is your environment. So you're going to be learning about all the foods, all the herbs, all the mushrooms, all the things that you can eat, that you can't eat, what their effects are going to be, how to use it as a coagulant if you get cut. Um, all those kinds of things are going to be common knowledge because you might be out and about doing whatever it is that you're doing, and you get scraped, you get scratched, you get bitten, something like that. You need to be able to deal with it. So that kind of knowledge is going to be more generalized. But when it comes to spirituality, when it comes to maybe some of the bigger issues or major sicknesses, that's when you start running into having um, some sort of a shaman or a medicine man. Most of these communities live at a subsistence level. Okay, and what that means is that they are living sort of on I wouldn't say like a day to day basis, because oftentimes they are a little bit more prepared than that. But essentially, you're out gathering resources for the daily meal, for the if you're going into winter, then you might stockpile some of those resources to prepare, but you're not really gathering things like wealth, right? Wealth in itself isn't necessarily a big concept, especially when you have to pack everything around. So subsistence level um, living is really common in nomadic societies. Uh, and it can be perilous depending on your situation. If your community is not doing well, then you can have serious troubles for your band. So you have to be well skilled in how to live a subsistence level existence, and lots of people have done it. We have lived this particular way for the vast majority of human existence. So obviously, it's very a very capable way of living a life. Okay. So as I said, bands have been the dominant way of organization for human existence. Right. This is how, for the last 100,000 years, we have been doing things up until the last uh, probably about the last 10,000 years. And even then, 10,000 years ago, we started seeing the first sort of like organization and agriculture being developed. And agriculture itself is a sign of communities that become sedentary and grow into larger and larger populations. But even within the last 500-600 years, we still had a massive amount of people in this world that were living in band level and nomadic lifestyles. So the majority of human existence has been and continues to be, because we still have a lot of folks out there that are living band level lifestyles, um, a major part of how humans organize themselves. Um, we think that through cultural and possibly even biological necessity, the idea of having an egalitarian society has been sort of one of the main motivators for us to get to where we are today. And by that, to become a society to sort of survive, we had to share, right? We had to share resources, share knowledge, share capabilities to get to where we are today. That's important to recognize. Um, that we didn't get here by being the smartest, by being the toughest. As a species, we are not particularly tough, right? We're not particularly strong. We're not particularly fast. We don't have sharp claws or big teeth or great hearing or particularly great eyesight. Um, but what we can do is we can work together. And that's really sort of how we distinguish ourselves as a species, is our capability of communicating to each other. Communication and language being our absolute number one tool of all time, is the ability to communicate, and by being able to communicate, we can then collaborate. Okay, and to do that, we have benefited each other, and when we benefit each other, guess what happens? Well, everybody benefits, right? And then we grow bigger. So egalitarianism has definitely been sort of the foundation for all of our modern communities. And we see this sort of practice everywhere we go, right? This idea of egalitarianism. Um, and it's a part of our family structures, it's a part of our larger social structures, our federal government, in many ways, still has this aspect of egalitarianism, um, in which everybody helps and everybody benefits. And we'll talk a little bit about that more. So let's talk about the next sort of structure that takes place after the band level. So we talked a little bit about the size of bands. And when a band might get too big, it might splinter off into multiple bands. And then those bands might grow, and you might end up having a larger population of different bands. Well, tribes are usually the organization of multiple bands of people. Um, they can be both nomadic and stationary. Certainly in the past, we see a lot of nomadic, but in the last few hundred years, we've seen some of those tribes and bands become more stationary as agriculture starts to influence more cultures. And then there's also other political influences. If we think about North America and Central and South America, we start seeing those um, sort of nomadic lifestyles turning into stationary lifestyles, especially if they're being forced into that kind of living experience, right? So, like if we look at modern day tribes in the United States, then most of those groups, if they were nomadic, they are not anymore, right? Because they have been forced to move to and then continue to live on a reservation, which is a stationary place, right? You can't roam off of it, can't move to other locations to gather resources. You have to stay in that location. So that really had a huge change in how people lived, right? Especially if they went from a nomadic culture to a sedentary culture. Um, an example that I will use would be the Ute tribes. There are three Ute tribes. You have the Mountain Ute, the Southern Ute, and the Northern Ute tribes. Now, within those tribes, we have different bands that are recognized within those. So the different bands, they are going to be different family groups, different organizations um, that share a common language, common cultural ideals, but are just organized differently. And there's different lineages. Um, if we look at the Ute Mountain Tribe, the band that lives there is the Weemanooch. Okay, so the Weemanooch, that is what they call themselves. They don't call themselves Ute per se, unless they're uh, talking to outsiders, um, because the Ute is a term that was also given to them by the Spanish, and so that became a term that was put upon them. Um, and is also a part of the language. The Utes themselves speak Uto-Aztecan, right? And that in itself gives us an idea about sort of the traveling capability of the Utes. The fact that they are here in Colorado, in Utah, but then also have ties to central Mexico. Okay, so that language becomes really important to understand about its connections to other groups and other communities. The Southern Ute consists of two different bands. The Northern Ute consists of four different bands, for a total of 7 different bands within modern day Ute society. Now, the Utes themselves, if we go back in history, had at one point that we know of 12 different bands. But those bands were either absorbed or eradicated um, by U.S. federal government um, as they were coming through disease, through different manners in which many tribal groups ended up having to deal with, oftentimes uh, with major tragic uh, events that took place, and entire communities were wiped out. Um, and this was certainly a very common thing throughout the United States and North America in general, specifically when we saw um, essentially a Holocaust take place as disease ripped through the Americas. At one point, it's believed that there were somewhere in the range of 95 to about 112 million people that lived in the Americas. And that population was cut down by about 95% after first contact with Europeans. And a lot of that has to do with the spread of disease, things like smallpox. Smallpox, it can't be exaggerated at all, the impact that smallpox has had on this continent. Um, because of that, whole communities were wiped out. Imagine yourself in a room with 100 people in it, and then 95 of those people die, right? So that leaves five people left. That's what the Americas experienced. So that's something to be very conscious of um, when you think about American populations and the impact of disease on indigenous peoples. Okay, continuing. These bands are generally kinship based, so they still have connections to uh, different bands within that tribal organization, but they're usually more solidified. So as I was talking about before, bands are usually kinship based, but you don't usually marry within your kinship, right? So you want to marry outside of that. So that's usually where bands in different tribes become really important, is that they are going to share linguistic and cultural histories, but they're also outside of the family enough that it's a good place to find a partner and a mate to continue to propagate. And then by doing so, you also create political alliances between different groups, right? If you're going through a hard time and your band is going through a hard time, but you come across another band and you've got connections to that band, but they're doing a lot better, guess what? They're probably more likely going to be willing to share resources with that extended kin. Again, tribes are usually fairly egalitarian with very little hierarchy. Um, Again, a lot of it comes down to whoever was best at that particular job. So if you're a specialist, you're a really good hunter, you would be in charge of going out and hunting and that kind of stuff. Although once we start seeing tribes, we start seeing more hierarchy being established. But they're still typically very mobile groups. So we're still seeing a lot of the same band like attributes and behaviors. Tribes can number into the thousands of people. So that's when you start seeing sort of the bands as they grew larger and larger, um, you know, splitting off, still becoming larger. Those resources are plentiful. And if they are, then you can start seeing tribes begin to develop a very large population. If we look at tribes like the Navajo, currently the Navajo have about 300,000 people within that are counted as being Navajo. Uh, Navajos at one point were nomadic, but also had some pretty sedentary attributes, especially with their connection to how different Puebloans lived in the area. But the Navajo themselves actually have a language tied to the Athabascan people in and around the Arctic Circle. So in Canada, Alaska, they have a linguistic tie. And it's believed that they, somewhere about 800 years ago, immigrated from there and then landed in the middle of the Southwest. And they were mobile and built sort of a reputation in that area and established themselves. Today's Navajo looks more like a chiefdom or a nation than it does what we would consider to be a normal tribe of people, and it's because of the very large population. It's much more structured. There's a larger hierarchy, and so we start seeing that this has been the transformation from one type of system into another. And so yeah, it's changed from what it was to where it is today in quite a significant way. But a lot of that is due to sort of the forced means in which they have gained their current lands and then been forced to stay on those lands. And that's also really important to understand, is that even most tribes within the United States no longer look like what we would consider to be tribes. They look much more like chiefdoms or nation states. And that's because of the sedentary nature. And their political organization has changed from what it was pre-contact versus today. When we think about tribes themselves, we use tribes in the United States as a means to sort of designate ethnicity, right? So if I talk about the Navajo, if I talk about the Ute, if I talk about the Modoc, then we're really talking about different ethnicities, different cultures. And if we were outside of the United States, that's how we would typically refer to those groups, as having different ethnicities. Here, we are still using this sort of bygone terminology when we're talking about native and indigenous peoples as being tribes. of people, in which they are technically not. In fact, if we look at most reservations today by treaty, they are what we would consider to be sovereign nations, right? If I go down to the Ute Mountain Reservation here in Colorado, they are considered to be a sovereign nation. They have their own constitution. Um, they do not pay state or federal taxes. However, they are also considered to be a part of um, the federal system. They are federally recognized and organized tribes, so they still fall underneath federal federal protection, federal resources, that kind of stuff. However, the way that most constitutions that many of these tribes have created has established the fact that if they wanted to be completely sovereign, they could, but they have to meet um, certain requirements to get there, like having your own currency, um, and being able to create diplomatic relationships with other countries. And most tribes don't have the resources to sort of pull that off. And so they stay what we consider to be wards of the state, right? So they are um, a part of a federally recognized group that benefits from the federal government. And let me tell you that those benefits are minuscule, right? In general, there's not a lot of money that goes to tribes. And that's been the case for since we started creating treaties and putting folks on these reservations. They did not get much out of the deal. Definitely screwed. So, that's kind of how we look at um, again how different groups today in the United States are organized from band level, tribal level, and then we'll talk about chiefdoms. So a chiefdom is sort of where we start seeing what we consider to be like modern day states. So there's more of a hierarchical system, um, and we start seeing more sedentary practices. So we start seeing sort of the beginnings of agriculture. Chiefdoms themselves, instead of being nomadic, are sedentary. So they're usually um, arranged in uh, different villages, different towns, um, and that's when we start seeing sort of the a more diversification uh, uh, of activities. So we start seeing religions become more and more important because now you have people that can dedicate their lives to following a particular religion or following um, a particular skill, right? This is when we start seeing things like specialty crafting. We start seeing specialists in general, whether or not they're, in some cases, blacksmiths or um, farmers, ranchers, uh, uh, people making textiles, um, doctors or physicians. Uh, all of these people are going to be contributing to the culture in general, but they still have to eat, right? So in a chiefdom, you still have sort of, you start seeing more specialized occupations, but it's still egalitarian in most cases. Everyone is still contributing, but then those resources have to be redistributed, right? So the farmers, as they're out there gathering food and crops and preparing for the entire year, right? One person is going to be capable of having enough food for 100 people, right? That's the huge thing about agriculture, is that you don't have to have a large population uh, of people out there hunting and gathering to sustain themselves. You can just use a couple of people to sustain a lot of other people. Um, so agriculture becomes exceptionally important to the development of larger cultures, right? Because now people can spend more time studying things different from trying to sustain themselves, right? So, working on, again, crafting, textiles, religion, storytelling, all of those different things um, are now becoming more and more specialized. And chiefdoms um, become much more complex. So you now have more of a hierarchy. That hierarchy is oftentimes based on hereditary practices. So your family, um, if your grandfather was a chief or something like that, then that would get passed on to your father and then might eventually get passed on to you. And that's when we start seeing sort of um, the diversification of roles within these different societies. And where you might land in that. In some cases, you won't be able to get out of your particular um, occupation, right? If you're born a farmer, you're probably going to die a farmer, right? And that's the level of prestige, that's a level of influence you're going to actually have. Um, so it's hard. There's not a lot of mobility when it comes to where you are, where you're born within that society. As I said before, those resources that are gathered within that chiefdom is redistributed, and that's important to understand. It's kind of like, in a sense, taxes. Okay, we all contribute through taxes, and then those tax dollars get redistributed to resources that we believe we need. Um, and in this case, it's sort of the same way, except we're not necessarily thinking about like money-based economies. We're talking about the actual distribution of resources, so like foods and those kinds of commodities, tools, and that kind of stuff. That's um, we don't see sort of monetary development until much, much later, when we actually do have larger societies and we need to be able to um, bargain for different commodities, and then a cash economy begins to develop. And so we start seeing some cash economies being developed in chiefdoms, ways that we can trade for resources, whether or not that cash was done through the process of, in Polynesia, there were shell societies in which we have like dollar-sized shells that become that commodity that can be used to exchange. Um, so, right, that's one example. Um, Oftentimes, within these societies, and especially it's sort of um, counter to how we see things in the United States. But in many chiefdoms, we saw that you would gain prestige for yourself by how much you could actually give away, right? Say you built up over the course of a year a whole lot of resources. Um, the more that you gave away signified not only how resource rich you were, right, but how noble of a person you are as well, right? I've got so much, I can just give all of this stuff away, no problem, right? And it all works out. Um, so that's very different from our society, right? We usually play to win, right? We want to, whoever has the most toys at the end wins life. In this case, it's whoever gives away the most resources is the actual winner. So it's kind of antithetical to how we see things today. So what I want you to think about in this quick exercise is how do we as a society still engage in band level, tribal level, and chiefdom level behaviors? And I think it's kind of an interesting question to consider because we still do. So what I want you to do is take a few minutes to think about that, maybe write down a few ideas, and then we'll come back and then pause. We're going to pause right now and then come back. Okay. So hopefully you paused, wrote a couple of things down. We'll talk about some of those examples. So we still engage in things like reciprocity. In this case, we're talking about things like gift giving. Okay. Gift giving is important for us to sort of maintain relationships, cultural and social alliances. Uh, and gift giving comes in different ways. So, one of the ways that we see that being done is um, things like birthdays, Christmas, right? These are times when you go out, you gather resources, um, and then give them to someone else, right? It's somebody's birthday. So everybody comes together for a birthday party, everyone brings a gift, and that person gains a lot of resources, whatever those gifts are. But it's expected that when it's another person's birthday and you go to that birthday, that you also provide a gift, right? Now the thing is that we think about this as in sense of like redistribution of resources. Say like this year you just didn't do well, right? Kind of poor, right? You could really use the help. And this is why that birthday party becomes really important because that could be a really big boon to yourself and be able to, gather more resources and have a better life. And then when you go to someone else's birthday, you can't provide as much, but you provide something. Now, just in say like a few years, you've done really well, right? You're doing a heck of a lot better than you were before. And that person that gave you that really nice gift a few years ago, they've come upon hard times, right? So now you can gift to them a nice big fat gift, which you are not going to expect the same thing in return. And that has to do with the fact that you were able to experience that before. Same thing goes for other holidays. Why we do gift exchanges at like Halloween. Not Halloween. Halloween is part of it, right? We're still going out and gifting candy to kids and stuff like that. So there is redistribution there. But things like Christmas is one of those big times when we do that event as well. And then we have things like other types of redistribution, potlucks. So the potluck itself is based off of this concept called the potlatch, which was a Pacific Northwestern practice done by many of the tribes up there. And it's everybody brings food and everybody benefits, right? If you don't have a lot of food to bring, you still bring it. You might eat more than you brought, but you still contributed. Next time you bring more, and then someone else that doesn't have that much food can still benefit, right? So, right, that sharing of resources. Then we have things like taxes, right? We all pay taxes, and those taxes help, keep things going for us. And whether it's education, whether it's our streets, right? The fact that we have streets, we don't pay for them outright. We pay taxes to have those streets maintained and built. The fire department, police departments, right? Those are usually funded primarily off of the taxes of the state or the federal government. And then there's subsequental ways that they might um, gain resources as well. Shared wealth. So you might have family wealth that might be passed on from generation to generation, or if you become wealthy, then the rest of your family will benefit and your community will benefit. Those kinds of ideas. So we do a lot of redistribution, and it's a very socialist sort of ideology when it comes to the sharing of resources. We do this on the regular, whether or not it's gift giving, for holidays, whether or not it's taxes, and we're sharing our resources there and using those resources for what we generally consider to be the greater good. And there's obviously going to be lots of uh, comments about that, because greater good, what is the greater good? Especially in a society like ours, it's tough to tell sometimes. Um, we still do decision making by consensus, right? Um, Voting and the process of democracy. This is the idea where everyone has a voice, everyone shares that voice, everyone has an opinion, everyone has a say in what happens. So, right, when we're thinking about, again, shared decision making, um, we have developed ways of doing that in which people actually do have a say in what happens. So that's important to think about. We still have highly mobile populations, even by today's standards. Um, Over the last few centuries, we have typically had sort of larger family groups that develop in certain areas and they stay in certain areas. So you might have a large family group in a town or a city and they stay there. But once we started this process of globalization, and certainly by today's standards, if we think about the United States, we are a highly, highly mobile society, right? It is not much to consider, like if you were living in Oklahoma City and you wanted to move to Denver to go to school, or because you wanted to find a job, you could do so very easily. And that is a very highly mobile part of our society, right? And we are essentially doing the same thing as um, early hunter gatherers and nomadic peoples were doing, is going to wherever we need to go to find those resources. Um, so when you immigrate from, say, Oklahoma City to Denver, and that is a process of immigration, um, when we think about those kinds of terms, and I'll just sidetrack here for a second, the ideas of like immigration or migration, right? We immigrate within the United States anytime we move from a city to a city, right? And we immigrate on the inside of the country. Oftentimes, when we hear immigration, it's one person from another country coming to another country, right? Making that journey, that trip to get there. But immigration itself isn't just an exterior thing; it's an interior thing, right? And the process of migration could be, well, you lived in Oklahoma City, you go to school in Denver, and then you go back to Oklahoma City, right? That's migrating patterns. Okay. Um, and then sort of building ethnicity through shared history and location. Um, so we're building culture here. When you think about things like Denver and Colorado, if we think of Colorado as its own independent sort of state, which in many ways it is, excuse me, um, we start thinking about the culture that is around Colorado. And there are multiple cultures here. And we did sort of an exercise earlier on in the semester talking about this very specific thing. And it all comes down to creating identity, right? What is that cultural identity that is localized, right? The things that makes Denver Denver, the things that makes Pueblo Pueblo, or Colorado Springs, or Durango. What are the commonalities that we all share? What are the systems and the histories that we share? versus sort of the other geographical challenges, right? If we think about Native American communities, right, as a distinct ethnicity within Colorado, they have their own historical legacy in Colorado. They are as much a part of Colorado as any other community, but their history is distinct, right? It's very distinct from uh, what uh, what the rest of Westerners, as they came to Colorado, their culture is like. So, right, we've got multiple ethnicities that are dealing within that culture, but that's all a part of that Colorado identity at the same time. Okay, we're gonna end this segment here, and then we'll continue on to our next section in just a moment. All right, we'll talk to you in a few.